Hello and welcome to Let's Be Friends, a podcast about women's friendships. I'm Izzy and a very warm welcome to my guest Jess.
Hi there.
Hiya, thanks so much for joining us. And we're going to talk today about women's prisons and about the history of the rape crisis movement. Yeah. So Jess, you used to work in women's prisons. And what did you notice about the impact that going to prison had on women's social connections?
Yeah, it is a massive impact really on women when they go into the prison estate. There aren't many women's prisons across England and Wales, none in Wales actually.
Oh.
So it's a limited network. So women were often really removed from their sort of home community to come into custody. So often, probably sort of 30 or 40 miles at least away from their sort of home base. So in terms of maintaining connections with friends and family, that was often very, very challenging. Mm-hmm. And a number of the women's prisons are actually quite rurally sort of positioned. So in terms of being able to visit, that's often quite challenging. If your friends, your social connections, your friends and family, need to get to you via public transport.
Yeah,
that's a huge challenge, really. The prison estate, and this is sort of a COVID thing, really. They did sort of set up a system of sort of video calling for visits.
Okay.
But that was quite challenging, really. It's not a very reliable system. Mm-hmm. It required quite a lot of kind of vetting and preparation. You had to have a sort of setting in which you could be in contact and there weren't sort of moving objects in the background. So if you were in a home with your children and small children, it was really difficult actually to manage that space. And
also surely there's questions around not knowing who else might be in the room and things like that.
Yeah, so in terms of sort of security and vetting who was actually kind of participating in the visit, there were lots and lots of sort of administrative hurdles that sometimes meant that video visits weren't appropriate for your social, your family and your friends.
I know a lot of women in prison have experienced things like domestic abuse, and obviously you'd want to make sure that there was no one who was, potentially harmful to the woman who was in prison who was on that call as well, right?
Yeah.
That must be challenging.
Yeah, there were sometimes issues along those lines, but it's, often just not a very reliable system in terms of kind of the connections, and booking. It was also booking systems, so reliant on staff and wider networks to keep that system going. So lots and lots of challenges in terms of kind of visiting and connections there.
And it's not the same with video, is it? I mean, just in general, in day-to-day life, having a call with someone is never the same as seeing them in person.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's something about that kind of connection, being in the same space with people and really having that time to sort of connect face to face. I think video calling is it's not an equivalent form of communication. Women would have phones in their rooms, but there were difficulties and challenges in terms of keeping connected in that respect. You had to have credit to make phone calls. So, you were managing a budget and whether your friends and family could, top up your credit or not. There were sometimes limitations on that.
And potentially inequalities then between different women of who could afford to call home.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you've got quite a wide sort of social network, or maybe your children are in more than one location and you're trying to maintain contact, and you may have timed calls for your children, but the challenge of that in a prison environment, meeting those timings, it can be very, very challenging when you're not actually always in control of where you are and what you're doing. And it's a matter of sort of privacy as well. Very few women are in a room on their own, and so depending who you're with and what their schedule is and what the prison regime is, you don't always have privacy. To have those sort of those conversations, which you might want to keep very private, actually.
Definitely. I mean, yeah, the idea of not being able to speak to any of my close friends without someone that I maybe don't know well, or maybe don't even like or get on with, always listening, is really, you're not going to be able to share your real feelings or vulnerabilities or things like that at all.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think sometimes women did censor themselves. So chats I used to have with women, they were worried about worrying their friends and family, actually. So, they weren't able to be fully open. They were sort of self-censoring a little bit because they wanted to maintain their connections, but they didn't want to worry their friends and family. It is a tough environment. It can be very, very challenging. So they weren't always the easiest conversations, because you're actually, you're maybe trying to present a scenario that maybe isn't quite the truth, but you're trying to protect your loved ones. You don't want really to worry them. So I think a lot of women, would sort of self-censor in that respect, because they were concerned about the anxiety that they may cause, their close friends and family, if they were kind of brutally honest about what it was like and how they were feeling. So
and then they're not able to get that full kind of emotional support from their friends and family in that case, because I guess if you're not sharing the real struggles that you're going through for quite understandable reasons, then you're not able to kind of receive that, I don't know, kind of kind words and encouragement that they might then want to give you in that situation.
Yeah, absolutely. I had many conversations about about those issues, really, about wanting to maintain that connection, but not being able to be kind of fully open because you were worried about what the impact would be. So I think that then emphasizes how important it is for women to have emotional support, sort of support systems within prison, to allow women to sort of to fully explore where they're at and to be supported in that way. Yeah, absolutely.
Definitely. And on the topic of support systems in prison, how possible is it for women to make friends with each other in prison?
Yeah, I think there are those opportunities, and I think it's sort of there can be lots of things at play. I think there are quite a lot of challenges as well. Sometimes women I supported would sometimes find themselves with women that they actually know from the community.
Interesting.
And sometimes that can be a good thing. Sometimes that can be challenging, depending on how your relationship is outside.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Sometimes that can be an enormous support. Somebody who you get on well with, the lay of the land with, in a quite intense, a very intense environment, to have somebody that you can trust is enormously helpful. I think women were very nervous when they got a new pad mate, actually, to figure out if this is somebody I can trust, whether it is somebody that I can open up to, or whether it's somebody I need to be a little bit guarded with. So those were kind of times of real anxiety for women for women who'd built a really strong bond with somebody, to lose that pad mate. And sometimes it happens suddenly when women, sometimes, the prison system, criminal justice system doesn't work very smoothly. And sometimes there would be delays in sort of anticipated dates for women's release. But sometimes things happen really kind of quickly and unexpectedly. And you suddenly find yourself, your pad mate has been released for whatever reason. And you're now kind of anticipating somebody new coming in. And that can be, a real source of anxiety. But then I also saw kind of instances with, not only sort of in terms of how women shared a room with somebody, but on wings where there was a really sort of close-knit sort of community, I suppose, of women. And there was a really excellent support network. From my experience, that actually happened the most when there was a kind of mix of ages,
That's interesting.
And sometimes sort of older women who were there for maybe longer, did sort of maybe sort of become sort of surrogate mother figures, I suppose, a little bit. They had a lot of experience. They knew how things worked. They were able to support women, particularly women coming in for the first time, where everything is new, and it's a really intense environment. You've got to learn a lot in a very short space of time to sort of get yourself up and running, get everything you need, and you need that sort of information. Sometimes prison officers, staffing is under pressure, so they don't have a lot of time, and so the support of other women on a wing could be really, really valuable, and particularly when you have other challenges coming in into the prison system. You may be withdrawing from different substances, and you may be vulnerable for lots of other reasons, so some good sort of emotional support from women you can trust is really, really valuable.
No, that I can completely imagine that must completely change the experience based on what kind of relationship you have with the other people there. And do you know much about whether those friendships formed in prison tend to kind of continue once women leave?
I'm not sure actually. I didn't really I didn't speak to many women about those kinds of things. There were women I supported who were familiar, maybe had been in prison previously, and I think it was more if you sort of came back into prison and you happened to kind of be there at the same time as somebody you knew and trusted, then that was really valuable. But I think in my experience from the women I supported, I wasn't so aware of those relationships continuing kind of on the outside post-release. Often there were other challenges, and obviously, a real kind of drive to reconnect with your connections back in the community. Once you were released, it was sort of, getting back in contact with family, getting back in contact with friends. For a lot of women, it's getting back in contact with your children as well.
Yeah, of course.
And, getting those relationships back on track and sort of making up for that, what often feels like a lot of lost time, sadly.
Definitely.
So often that was the focus. So prison life and post-relief community life, I get the impression were, quite different really for women.
Yeah, that makes sense. And do you know what that process is like of reconnecting with your kind of relationships that you had before going to prison upon release? Is that something that's often very difficult, or?
I think there were some real challenges, from sort of my perspective. Sometimes, over the time that I was visiting prison, some of the women I supported went out and came back in. So I would sort of pick up my sort of support relationship with them, and we'd recap and we'd
it's nice
see
you
how
were able to
things
have
going.
that continuity of support.
Yeah, it was really, and I think it was useful for women actually coming back in, for me to be a constant and a familiar face, because turnover of prison staff was often, there was quite a bit of a turnover. There was some, some really excellent staff who were there and were still working with different cohorts of women, and that was a constant. But I think that was reassuring when women came back in. But sort of sometimes there were real challenges in, women would kind of report back about the challenges that they'd had in the community, reconnecting and sort of re-establishing those relationships. It really is a kind of huge rupture kind of coming into prison, particularly if you are a long way away geographically. That challenge of maintaining the contact, and then when you are released, you're often dealing with multiple things. You're trying to you're trying to kind of sort of repair connections with people and relationships with people, or re-engage and get back to where you were. But you often got, women have got multiple challenges in terms of housing, in terms of of support, continuing support maybe with substance abuse and the challenges sort of trying to get back into work and things like that. And, it's and probation and the challenge of probation, which is, a very difficult system to navigate for women. So lots of things going on often when you post-release. And
what impact do you think that has on women sort of going forward, the fact that their personal relationships have been disrupted, both in terms of, I guess, their well-being, but also in terms of repeat offending and things like that?
Yeah, I think it is. I think there is a challenge there. I think, I would say, kind of those really sort of strong connections with people possibly could be a sort of protective factor in terms of hopefully not reoffending. But if there have been ruptures and to rebuild those connections, if that is very challenging, that can lead women to I think sometimes to be quite vulnerable to other factors coming into play in their lives, and which might lead to reoffending or recall for maybe breaching sort of terms of release and things like that. So I think it's a really difficult time, and I then kind of it speaks to, it kind of contributes to this debate about how it's a factor in the debate about how useful is it sending, a large majority of women into the prison system for non-violent, quite low-level crimes, when the impact on their lives is just so huge, and the challenges then that presents them, and what a barrier it is to not reoffending, So, there's a huge amount there. I think it's definitely a contributory factor to that discussion, I think.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. What are your thoughts around that?
Well, I having sort of worked with women and experienced the prison system, my view would be that that there are, a large proportion of women for whom the prison system just doesn't work. It's not really addressing the offending. It's not really addressing what the root cause of the offending is. And then the experience of coming into the prison system, it causes so many ruptures, which then, presents such a challenge to overcome in terms of moving on with your life. My personal view is that women would be much better served with kind of community-based support, sort of structured around a women's centre, where their needs as women can be met, and you can develop gendered responses to the things that have been the challenges in their lives. And I think there's quite a lot of evidence that model works really well.
Is it a model that's been tested out in other places then? I
think so. Well, there are women's centres that work really effectively around the country, but it is a little bit of a patchwork. The provision isn't enough, really, like all these things, isn't it? There's not enough of them, and probably some women's centres I guess are probably quite limited in terms of the range of services that they would offer, whereas some where they have been able to kind of have a real breadth of support, and some with programs that are really tailored to women who are in contact with the criminal justice system. I think there is research that suggests that is really effective. That's a really effective model, and I would guess, I haven't got this sort of to hand in terms of cold hard facts, but I would guess that would be a more cost effective way of supporting women. But obviously it requires investment up front to expand the network and really sort of have sustainable services there. But keeping women in the community keeping those connections with friends, family and children, which are really, really helpful. But then the added support of a women's centre offering sort of tailored support to meet their needs, I think, would be phenomenal. But I think it's just very patchy in terms of where in the country that is available and how many women can access that at any one time, really.
Yeah. And I suppose at the moment, a lot of our support that focuses on issues that primarily affect women is all quite fragmented into those specific issues. Like there are rape crisis centres, there are domestic abuse organisations and refuges. There are maybe a few specific programmes that focus on maybe women with substance abuse issues or things like this, but I think there's very little joined up thinking with all of those different issues.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think what you ideally want is like a holistic approach, sort of recognising that women's needs, they don't sort of fit neatly into separate boxes often, do we? We know women's lives are complicated and often there is a need across a kind of broad range of areas. So a women's centre who can potentially sort of connect with other specialist women's services for those areas where maybe they don't have that experience, but sort of providing a base where they can pretty much provide this sort of holistic support for women, I think is really would be ideal.
No, it sounds really interesting. And do you think there's a scope, as well as for them sort of connecting in with specialist organisations like domestic abuse or rape crisis organisations, for also kind of helping facilitate those personal support systems as well? Because I think often that kind of is what gets lost. In my previous work with domestic abuse victims, you'd be sitting around with all of these professionals, but someone's actual day-to-day support system would be completely absent from the conversation.
No, I think you're right. I think peer support comes into that, and the women and a women's centre being a space where you could meet other women and make new connections, or you may find that you have connections with other women who are using that centre, and it could be a space to kind of sort of reinforce or build that connection. I think there's a huge amount that could be done there. Just from my personal experience and sort of moving back into the prison system. The service I was delivering, and this was a hangover from COVID, really. I was offering a lot of sort of one-to-one support because the regime and, for COVID reasons, I was having to see people face-to-face, but one-on-one. But we sort of realised we were sort of continuing in that sort of model, and took a step back and kind of got women together and say, well, does this meet your needs, really? And for the type of support I was providing, we started realising when we got all the women together and started having a chat about what they needed, they really did want to come together with women who'd had similar experiences. That's what they needed and that's what they wanted. They wanted to share those experiences. They wanted to be in a space with women who knew what it was like, who knew what it was like to go through the things that they'd gone through, and they wanted a range of activity. We didn't want every single time to talk about that topic, but just we might do totally different activities, but knowing that you're in a space with women who've had a similar experience, that's what women were sort of looking for. So that was really interesting, and I think I'm sure in a community space that would be a similar need, I would think. I'm sure many women would find that useful and helpful. No, definitely. And that's really interesting, and it's great that you were able to kind of mold the service you were delivering to meet the needs of the people you were delivering it for. I think that's so important with any of these things, to be kind of responsive to the actual people. But it gets lost, doesn't it? It does. And I think sometimes when you're in working environments like the prison, which is it's a very controlled environment, they have a regime, everything is timed and people move about at certain times, and as an outside organisation coming in, you have to kind of negotiate with the prison system as to how you're going to slot into that. And there are boundaries, there are limitations as to what you can do, but we would often think, right, well, we know there are some limitations, but what can we do within the space and, that we do have, and how can we make that space work for the women? How much can they influence what we do in that space? And coming out of COVID, we realised we'd sort of shrunk a little bit more. We were constricted by the prison system. That's just the way it is. But we've become even more restricted, and it was really important that we sort of re-engage with all the women and try to carve out more space for them to do exactly what they need. And I felt like that was part of our role, actually, helping to advocate for what women needed, really, and sort of using the connections and the lines of communication that we had, which was a little bit above what the women could have themselves. We could kind of smooth that path and hopefully get some resources so the women could do what they wanted to do.
And I think that's a really key thing for professionals in any space to be doing, is kind of using that organisational power that they have to actually uplift the voices of the people that they're working with. And as you say, you had the resources, you had the lines of communication, and then actually giving them what they were asking for, which is really interesting. In this case, what they're asking for is basically more room to connect with each other.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it is. It's sort of, and I think sometimes you're pushing a little bit against the kind of institution, particularly with in a prison system. But I don't think it's sometimes in the community there are quite rigid systems, aren't there? And
100%.
And everybody kind of gets into a mindset that, well, this is the way we do it, and these are the limits of what we can do. But I think there's always space to sort of slightly push at those boundaries and say why,
Yes. Yeah.
and when you get an opportunity to do something a little bit different, and hopefully it works for everybody involved, you can say, oh, this is why we've we want to do things a little bit differently, because look at what happens when we can find those little spaces to do something a little bit different. It can have an enormous impact on people, and really a very positive impact.
Yeah. And what kind of feedback did you get from the women who participated in that?
Yeah, it was really, really good, actually. I'd sort of had an inkling from talking to women one-to-one. We were going to come together. We were going to chat about this. I kind of had an inkling about what women were sort of saying, what they wanted. But they, collectively and quite overwhelmingly, women wanted to come together and have a regular group where not too sort of prescribed, where they could choose, they could sort of plan sessions.
Oh, cool.
And we could, do things together, do sort of crafting activities, do the things that is quite difficult to sort of do when you're on a wing, when there's lots of noise, there's lots of stuff happening. People have got different roles that they need to meet. There's a lot of noise and lots going on. But coming away from that, spending time with other women who've had similar experiences, not yet, like I said previously, not necessarily talking about those experiences in that moment, but just doing something, a shared activity together, knowing that these are women that you have that connection with. And that's overwhelmingly what women were saying they wanted, really. Yeah.
I think there is something really important about being around people who understand what you've been through. I think there is something, I don't know, there's something meaningful about that. There's a lack of needing to explain yourself and things like that I think can be really significant.
Yeah, I think it's sort of like an unspoken kind of solidarity, really, isn't it? Sort of knowing and actually we've sometimes it's about sort of naming your group as well, and sort of knowing that just thinking again about sort of the women I was working with in the prison, we knew that this group was going to be for women who'd been through a particular experience. So anybody coming to that group would know that, and you'd know that those other women in that space had that experience. And I think just the act of coming together with that knowledge is, you can take something from that, and there is solidarity, and there is sort of collective strength in that, perhaps.
Yeah. And I think with a lot of negative personal experiences that women often go through, like sexual violence or domestic abuse or things like that, because there's then kind of cultural shame and stigma around it, you don't often talk about it. So I think a lot of women are walking around feeling very isolated and feeling like, maybe I did something wrong to bring this upon myself because I am uniquely experiencing this terrible thing, when actually a huge proportion of the female population and some of the male population as well are experiencing that. I think realising, oh, I'm not alone in this is a prevalent thing, can kind of undo some of that, I guess, accepting of the cultural responsibilising that's put onto women.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're right. I think sort of, coming together and knowing that you're not alone, and that you're in a space where you can address those experiences, and you'll be believed and all those kind of things is just huge. It's absolutely huge. There's so much so much blaming, isn't there, of women, or women thinking they are feeling isolated in their experiences, and that they're alone and they're responsible. And when you come into a space where those things are sort of blown out of the water a little bit, it's it can be a huge thing, really. Can be a real sort of shift, I think, in how people then are able to kind of make sense of what has happened to them.
Definitely. And I think then having empathy for other people who've experienced what you've experienced can be the beginning of having kind of empathy and kindness for yourself, because sometimes if you've been pushed a lot of messages of what's happened to you was your fault and you've internalized that, then seeing other people who've experienced the same thing and being like, oh, but I don't blame her, like clearly that wasn't her fault. I think that can really make you think, hang on a minute, so is it my fault then?
Yeah.
Maybe not.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is where there is so much power in groups, for women who've had those experiences. I think you probably can get to that with sort of one-to-one support, but I just think there is something powerful to being in a group of women who've had a similar experience, and that challenge of going, well, it's absolutely, that's not on, that's not that woman's fault. And then then you can be kind to yourself in a similar way. I was reading about something I think that was more commonly said in the rape crisis movement some time ago, when centres were sort of getting up and running, maybe sort of in the 70s and 80s, but they talked about being your own best friend, and it's that exact stuff, really. Not blaming yourself. You wouldn't say that to your best friend who'd had a similar experience. So turning that sort of kindness and showing that to yourself, really. Absolutely.
Yeah, definitely. No, I think it's really important, and I think it's something that is an ongoing question with the modern rape crisis movement, is to what extent are we still kind of bringing forward those messages of solidarity and connection. And I know you've been doing a history project around the kind of history of the rape crisis movement. So I was wondering how that project's going. What are some of your early thoughts on kind of the changes that we've seen over time?
It's been really interesting, actually. I've sort of speaking with one of our volunteers who's a founding member of the centre that I'm involved in, and our kind of hopes for recording the history of our centre is that, hopefully we will do some oral history with women who've been there at the beginning and women who've been involved at different points in our history. Our centre's been going for about 40 years now.
That's amazing.
So it's a long history there. And sort of we have an archive of physical materials as well. So we're hoping to be able to sort of archive those and put them in our local archive as a resource for other people.
So interesting.
It is really interesting. But just talking to women who've been involved right from the beginning, I think there has been quite a shift in the model and the approach. Absolutely sort of back in those sort of early days, a clear understanding of sexual violence as a social issue. And just very clear sort of on women coming together and supporting each other, really, women supporting other women, sort of less of sort of hierarchical organisation. So it wasn't as if we were sort of different from the women coming to the centre, because there was an acknowledgement that, you know, most women coming to that space would have had, whether they were sort of offering support or receiving support, would have had experiences. And so it was a space for women to come together. Some of those women had spent time sort of preparing and learning about sexual violence so that they could offer support. And then obviously women were coming into the centre to receive that support. But then it was it becomes a community, because often women who've come in for support stay with the centre, and then when they're ready, they offer support as well. And we were just very clear on training. You know, there was a very clear training programme, and the focus of that training programme, it was a feminist analysis of sexual violence. So very much a kind of, you know, social, looking at it as a social issue, and less, you know, not so much as a sort of thinking about sort of a medical model, which I think is perhaps one of the ways in which the rape crisis movement has sort of evolved. There's been more of an absorption of a sort of more of a medical model approach to sexual violence. So I think probably across the network, you probably see a lot of counselling being offered. In my centre, it's still emotional support. So, you know, that counselling model, I think, sits more with a sort of medical approach. And so that individual, a very individually sort of focused response to sexual violence, which there always was in that, you know, original kind of ethos and principles. It absolutely was support for the individual, but within that sort of broader understanding of sexual violence as a social issue. And I kind of worry that as things have progressed and we've become more kind of influenced maybe by the sort of medical, the very individualized sort of trauma sort of focused response, that maybe we're kind of losing the sort of social kind of underpinnings, that understanding, that feminist analysis, and that social kind of understanding that once you can kind of bring that into the space at the same time as offering that individual support, I think really can help women to understand it as a bigger issue. And then I think that sort of really addresses some of the issues of self-blame that women can have, because actually, you know, you can help women understand this is something bigger. You know, we're here to support you and what you've been through, but part of what we're doing is helping you understand this is something bigger, and how that sits for you, really. And then there are other women who are here to support you. They've had similar experiences, but they're here to support you, and then ultimately hopefully do something about it, which is you know, can be a very kind of positive response to having experienced sexual violence. Actually coming together with other women to tackle it
definitely
can be very valuable.
It's interesting. I know Fiona Vera Gray's written about this, and she had interviewed some of the sort of veterans of the rape crisis movement, and one of them had said that bringing some of the women to Million Women Rise, which is like an annual protest against violence against women, had actually, in her view, done about a year's worth of the good that counselling would have done, because it was that kind of feeling of connecting with other women and putting into action, sort of trying to change the systems that had led to the experience of sexual violence, which I thought was so interesting.
Oh, absolutely. And I think it's true. At our centre, we always organise a Reclaim the Night March, and sort of bringing women together. I think it's to shout in the streets and to draw attention to the issue is like enormously valuable. And I think it's really valuable for women working in centres actually to kind of reconnect with that and to kind of ground themselves, and, you know, and it's a moment to kind of reflect and think, right, yes, this is what this is about. This is an integral part of what we're doing. Actually, we're wanting to challenge these systems. We want to kind of, you know, we want to disappear. You know, in an ideal world, don't you? You know, you don't want to have a need for a rape crisis centre. So that has to be a part of what you're doing. That you're challenging the system and that if in bringing women together, do that collectively is enormously powerful.
Definitely. And I think it's a really complicated thing, as with funding and with being increasingly required to participate in multi-agency systems and things like that. I think it's really complicated to be a part of a system like a child protection system, for example, while also trying to retain your own values and your own kind of criticisms of the state and of wider models and culture. I think it's a delicate balance that a lot of centres are having to tread.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. And I think particularly because we're in such quite a bleak funding situation, yes. And there's a huge amount of pressure on centres now with funding, and it feels so fragile. You're desperate to keep things going, and often there are lots of requirements from your funders to meet what they see are the needs of the cohorts of the people that you're supporting through the centre, and it is really hard because they aren't the experts. That's the challenge, which I find really frustrating, is that often there are conditions sort of being dictated to you by funders.
Yeah.
And they're not the experts. The centre, the women within that centre and the women coming for support are the experts on this subject.
Yes.
And finding routes to kind of challenge that when you're so in need of the funds is so hard. And it's part of a bigger system that we know that does a lot of harm to women. So finding those spaces to be a sort of I call a critical friend, really. So, you have to toe the line, it's hard, but finding those opportunities and those spaces to present, to present a slightly different view, to just push back a little bit. I think it is a massive challenge, but I think it is one that the rape crisis movement really, needs to be sort of constantly working at, because I think that's one of the ways in which we challenge what happens to women. We challenge this culture, rape culture, and a culture that normalizes what happens to women, and we have to find all those avenues in which we sort of push back. It's a tricky one. I'm always really interested when I look back at the history of the centre I'm involved in. There's some really sort of key kind of pivotal moments in terms of how the centre is sort of slightly reshaped at different points in time, and it is connected. I feel, this is my analysis, so others may disagree, and it may be very different for other centres, but I feel there are sort of key points where the need for sort of to be in receipt of some additional funding, which suddenly becomes available, but the conditions that come with that slightly shift how the centre operates. So, I always sort of reflect on, there was quite a pivotal moment where there's some Ministry of Justice money, some ring-fenced allocated Ministry of Justice money became available. This is some years ago now, but one of the conditions that came with that you couldn't be a collective, you couldn't be a women's collective, which was our model in our centre at that time, and you had to become for us it was a charitable incorporated organisation, right, with a board suddenly. So quite a different structure and a hierarchy is imposed as a condition, really, of
so had it previously not been hierarchical then?
No, so it operated as a women's collective. The volunteers who worked in the centre made decisions collectively, which has its own challenges as well.
Of course, yeah. Which may not any model will have challenges.
Exactly, which may not always be the most efficient system, and you could argue that there probably were hierarchies working in those systems anyway, but this sort of a very different system imposed by a funder.
Yeah, and that's the key, isn't it? It's like there are benefits to both models, but it wasn't that these women came together and said, actually, this model isn't working for us, we need a new model. Yeah. It's, existentially, we probably won't survive as an organisation without this money, so therefore we have no choice, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. And then sometimes that, and I think the nervousness for the women who were part of our centre at that time, they had to bring in other women who weren't already part of the network necessarily to form this board, and then you sort of think, well, will everybody, be on the same page? And then your organisation has to think, well, how do we get everybody on the same page? And for us, it was all about everybody doing the same training, actually, whether you were a trustee, whether you were a paid worker or a volunteer, no matter really what role you were doing, we all sat down together and we kind of learnt about a feminist analysis of sexual violence, so that we understood that everybody kind of understood that underpinning, and we made our decisions, with that knowledge base. So that was sort of integral for us to keep that ethos and those principles and those values of the original rape crisis movement going. Just although we were sort of having to mould ourselves to meet the needs of, to meet those needs in terms of getting funding so that we could continue.
Yeah, and that's actually quite similar to the rape crisis organisation that I'm a trustee of. We have a really detailed, in-depth training process that is more training than I've ever had when starting a job, actually, when I started volunteering for them, because everyone volunteers, I say volunteers, trustees, everyone has the same training. So it's interesting, that's a similarity there.
No, I would agree. My training was very extensive and over a long period of time, and very, very carefully done, and lots of opportunities for kind of reflection, and lots of opportunities to kind of share thoughts and things like that. But I think it's probably the most intensively I've been trained for any other role I've done. So
it's really interesting. I think a big question to me with the kind of evolution of the rape crisis movement and what are the benefits and downsides of the changes is around how we've moved from a more, I guess, solidarity based, with lots of self-disclosure, not so much of a separation between like workers and service users, as we kind of would say today, more just kind of we're all women coming together to support each other, into a much more professionalised model where, it's very important now culturally, as in business culture kind of these organisations, you have your professional boundaries and you're not making self-disclosures. And you certainly wouldn't be sharing your personal contact details with a client or things like that. What is your view on that? Because I feel quite conflicted about, I can see benefits to both models and I'm not quite sure where I sit.
I think it is a tricky one. I think sort of from my experience of my time at my rape crisis centre, and actually I've seen quite a lot of changes over the period of time that I've been there. So I've been there probably about 8 years, but I feel like there's been quite a change in the past 8 years even, and a real sort of a real increase in paid members of staff, and a real, actually sadly in our case, a real reduction in volunteers.
We've had exactly the same.
And I feel like we're missing something there. It's changed the dynamic, and not to take away from the excellent work that paid staff do, but I think there was something about having a mixture of women, and particularly having sort of volunteers, and having routes that women who've been supported by the centre can then come back into the centre and provide support, or do other roles. Providing support might not be, isn't for everybody, but being within the centre, being part of that collective, I think is really, really valuable. I know that when we ran a helpline, sadly, that's one of the things that's been lost from our centre. Women who rang in would often comment when they found, for sometimes it just came up that we were volunteers, because women would ask if we got paid to do this, and we would say, well, no, on the helpline that's run by volunteers. We do have some paid staff and we have some volunteers, and again, not to take away from the work of paid members of staff, it had a real impact on women that other women would come in the evening or in the daytime and spend time on the phone listening and supporting other women, and they weren't paid for it. And I feel it showed, I think it kind of conveyed and demonstrated to them that they were valued, and they were deserving of this support, absolutely, because I think a lot of women didn't feel that way. And we could reassure them that we we wanted to be there.
Yeah.
We wanted to support, and they were important. They were really important. What they had to say on the helpline was really important, and that's why we were here, because we wanted to listen to them and create that space for them to say whatever they needed to say. So yeah, and I think it does bring a different dynamic. And it becomes more hierarchical, because you have to have people to manage other people, and again, it's another kind of shift in terms of the way things work. I think, obviously boundaries are really, really important, and I think I think we were, as volunteers, and when I was trained, no matter who you were within the organisation, it was really important that certain boundaries were maintained for everybody's safety, really. But I think you can still get to that sort of collective support, women supporting other women, but still have those structures in place just to keep people safe. But yeah, there's something so powerful about that, and I think those shifts in the balance between sort of paid staff and volunteers, I think we have lost that a little bit. I think that is just one of the casualties of that shift, I would say.
Yeah. But then it's a difficult one, because I agree with that, but then I also, the work that is done by these centres and by the people working at them is important work. And there's a part of me that is, any field that is female dominated is underpaid.
Yes.
That's even if more women go into a field, the pay goes down. That's like something that's been tracked. So part of me is almost like, but this work is important. Why does our economy not reward this important work? Do you know what I mean? And why does it not enable people? A lot of people working in these fields can't even afford to live off the money that they're earning. The irony is a lot of women working in women services can't afford to live without living with a partner, which is a huge, dilemma, difficulty.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there.
There's a lot to unpack there.
There's a huge amount to unpack.
So in a way, I'm like, well, not only should they be paid, they should be paid more, because you should be able to live off the work that you do.
Yeah. Absolutely, it's highly skilled work. You're not wrong. You're absolutely not wrong. It's highly skilled work, which is really valuable, and so yes, women should be compensated if they are doing that. I really get your argument.
Well, it's not even that's my argument. That's part half of my brain arguing with the other half.
Yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, even with the professional boundaries thing, that was definitely something that was a big part of when I was working with domestic research teams. That was a huge part of how we worked. And, I've seen, for example, there's a prominent disability activist whose name is escaping me at the moment, but who talked about how it's really important that carers don't refer to themselves as friends for the disabled person that they're working with, because it's a misrepresentation, and you might leave that job and then they're like, but why are you leaving my life? Are we not friends? And it's kind of that lie, and that he basically says we're covering up the fact that a lot of disabled people are really isolated. I think obviously that's specific to disabled people and carers, but I think it has applicability in the work that I did, and I found that very important, because if you refer to yourself as a friend to someone, and domestic abuse victims are also another group that are very isolated by design, by perpetrators, I felt like I needed to not replace people's support, like Indigenous support networks and their friendship groups, because that they needed that. And I wasn't going to be there forever, and I might leave that job and we'd never see each other again. So I felt like the boundaries were important in that sense. But then on the other hand, I do find really compelling arguments. Like I went to that talk by Sue Robson, who's an amazing kind of academic and practitioner in various different women's areas. And she's very much arguing for a return to that solidarity, that kind of more genuine connection, because she has a program called Tina's Haven, which is with women who have lost contact with their children because of addiction. And it's a very emotionally connected work, and it very much relies on self-disclosure and being like, we're all women here together. You know, I've been through this, you've been through this. I might have a specific skill base in this area, but like we're all just women coming together. I thought that was really interesting and really compelling. And she was kind of arguing that should be the direction of the kind of women's sector. And I feel conflicted. I'm really on the fence about it.
Yeah, that is interesting. I'm just sort of reflecting now on, because my experiences sort of in terms of providing support was always in a helpline setting.
Yeah, so it's not long term.
So not necessarily long term, although we did have some callers who were regular callers, and we did know their name. We did recognise their voice. You know.
Would they tend to recognise your voice?
I think there was a recognition of who individuals were on the helpline, but I think we on the helpline we tried to be sort of really consistent in terms of our responses. So, and we did group supervision as well as individual supervision sometimes, but a big part of what we did was group supervision to talk about our kind of practice, really. I think it was good to bring something of yourself, not your personal details, but something of your own personality to how you supported women. But we did talk a lot about sort of kind of the consistency in our approach, which, you know, and elements that had to be sort of boundaried or consistent. And I felt that was probably a way of hopefully reassuring women who maybe did call us more regularly, that whoever picked up the phone, that they would get, you know, they would be well held and well supported no matter who picked up the phone. So that maybe we sort of avoided a sort of particular kind of one-to-one sort of dependency and things like that. So I think that's probably how we approached it on the helpline. So it was a friendly space. It was a really super supportive space, but you would get that, you know, hopefully pretty consistently, you know, taking into account our own personalities,
of course,
and, you know, that you would have that consistency and that security that anybody you spoke to within the centre, you would be held in that way and get that kind of support. So
yeah, and I think that warmth is important, isn't it? And that kind of acknowledgement of your shared humanity, whether there's actually going to be a friendship element or not.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Jess. This has been such an interesting conversation. And thank you very much for listening. We've got new episodes coming out on Wednesday afternoons. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Izzy.